Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Dario Guarascio, an associate professor of economic policy at the Department of Economics and Law at La Sapienza University of Rome. He is an external affiliate of the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, of the National Institute for Public Policy Analysis, and of the Nexus Center for Internet and Society, the Polytechnic University of Turin. Dario Guarascio's research covers economics of innovation, digitalization, labor markets, and European economy and industrial policy. His research has been published in many international journals. Currently, his research is focusing on the relationship between large digital platforms and the military apparatus. For La Terza Eds, he is about to publish Digital Imperialism, Economy and War at the Times of Digital Platforms and AI. I welcome Dario Guarascio to Savage Minds. I'm so happy to have you here.
Yeah, me too.
In your paper, Big Tech and the U.S. Digital Military-Industrial Complex, co-authored with Andrea Coveri and Claudio Cozza, you investigate where state-corporation boundaries may become quite blurred, significantly blurred, in fact, as you write, quote, "With the digitalization of the world economy, this overlap becomes even stronger, controlling digital networks and the choke points through which information flows from one continent to the other allows for weaponizing interdependencies," end quote. Now, I would like to start off not linearly in your article, but to skip to that part where you wrote about how John Hobson published Imperialism, a book entitled Imperialism in 1902, where he underscores how military campaigns were crucial for opening new markets, you write, securing the supply of raw materials and putting competitors out of business. Now, this is part of warfare, but also at the time, colonial endeavor. Can you talk about the older history of the links between markets, military, and colonial endeavors together with the state?
Yes. Well, when we started researching digital platforms and trying to understand the very drivers of power of economic entities like platforms becoming, in many instances, larger than states and with a systemic size and also a control of systemic infrastructure, making them to a significant extent, let's say, counterparts of nation states, we understood that we had to rediscover some very important contributions in the history of social sciences, of economic thought, broadly speaking. And immediately we went to the basis of what we can call imperialism theories. John Hobson is in fact the first identifying this term in describing the convergence between the needs of large capital, which at the times were large industrial cartels, so group of firms mostly operating in industrial and raw material sectors, being strongly linked with big financial corporations, banks, which used to have an important need, relentlessly finding avenues for exporting capital, finding new markets and avenues to valorizing their capital, in particular when, let's say, national markets and, at the time, advanced economy start having saturated markets, start having contradictions, making, let's say, reproducing capital more challenging. And so here we are with the need of rapidly internationalizing. And what happens when you have to rapidly internationalize, as it happened, if you like, at the times of the West India Company, is that you start fighting against other big economic entities having the same objectives. And what Hobson understood is that the state is a fundamental partner and as needs that are fundamentally intertwined with big monopolies, with big cartels, having the need of internationalizing, of securing routes and markets to obtain raw material, critical components, and all the means that are needed to produce goods and to stay on the market in a more competitive way than, let's say, competitors, of course. And so basically, the fundamental intuition of Hobson, then Hilferding, and finally Lenin, who translated into a political pamphlet the idea of imperialism, is that the need of large capital conglomerates to internationalize and to beat competitors in the international arena becomes fundamentally intertwined with what he defines as the imperialistic strategies of states. Why? Well, because states go abroad in order to find areas to subjugate, in order to extract raw materials, to have technological and economic dependency vis-à-vis local workers or local enterprises. And as I said before, in order to control and secure trade routes and, if possible, to cut out competitors from these very same routes. But finally, when the economic competition, economic struggles with all the potential means becomes even harder, well then military means become the everyday strategy in order to penetrate international markets, in order to make foreign governments let's say, disposed concerning opening up their market to foreign capital, and at the very end, in order to prevent competitors to enter the same markets. So basically, what Hobson, Hilferding, and Lenin described very well at the beginning of the 20th century, basically identifying the economic roots of what then would have been the two global conflicts, starting with First World War and then with Second World War, where the clash between strong technological and economic poles fighting to dominate markets, basically, and to secure fundamental trade and yes, trade and routes to access raw materials and technology is clearly one of the fundamental drivers of the conflicts that then would have explode globally. So basically, these are the, if you like, classical roots of what we are witnessing today, of course, with a new technological dress, with a changed shape, but with a very similar kind of substance. There is, however, another significant phase, which is the monopoly capitalism phase, which starts in the early 60s and then unfolds in terms of economic and social sciences theory in the 70s, with scholars like Baran and Sweezy, but then also Keith Colling and other UK-based economies. Well, basically, these economies rediscovered some of the main insights stemming from the imperialism tradition and applied these insights to the new shape of the world economy dominated by multinational corporations. So multinational corporations, with their peculiar relationship with the state and with their capacity to affect state decision and to make state more and more instrumental to their needs, become new kind of imperialistic entities, of course operating in a very different way as compared to the cartels that Hobson and Lenin used to study at the beginning of the 20th century, yet with a with some similarities concerning their crucial role in promoting the internationalization of capital, in creating situation of economic and technological dependency, and so basically in creating sphere of influence centered around dominant poles, like the US has been after World War II, but also making, again, military activities and war a crucial ingredient in this story. Why? Well, because as capitalism is a system made of contradictions and crises, so basically having crisis as something that is inherently contained within the workings, the inherent operations of the capitalist system, well, then even multinational corporations tend to face phases of stagnation, of insufficient demand, and of sluggish profits, of course. How to circumvent crises and problems of profit accumulation? Well, resorting on military expenditure and of public expenditure aimed at buying weapons, at supporting wars, at supporting industrial restructuring, as it is happening right now with technologies that are more and more switching from commercial to military applications, become a very useful way for large capital agglomeration to came out from crisis and from stagnation phases. So basically what Baran, Sweezy, Heimer, Colling, and colleagues in the 60s and 70s understood is that even if in a new shape, even if in a context very different from the one that characterized the phase of First World War and of Second World War, well, in any case, the relationship between state and large internationalized corporation and the need of large internationalized corporation to expand their activities, to export capital, to penetrate into international markets, and as I said, to escape phases of crisis. And on the other hand, the need of the state to support its most important capitalistic entities and to fight against alternative and competing poles that are challenging hegemony is in a way a new form of imperialism, which basically is what we observed in the face of large multinational companies, mostly of the manufacturing sector, like the ones that dominating the evolution of the global capitalistic system in the second half of the 20th century.
Excellent. I love this. The funny thing is that Lenin was very influenced by Hobson. They had a disagreement about certain things like the need for reform, but fundamentally it seems that World War I provided the context for both theorists to demonstrate that imperial rivalry could in fact lead to war, and World War I supported Lenin's view of capitalism's violent instability. But what has changed from then, 110 years later, roughly? Obviously, in the time of pre-World War I, when these theories were born, the world was a bit different in terms of how nation states were formed, even the normalization of war itself. It's being renormalized today as well, by the way, right? Look at Trump with Venezuela. Those are drug boats. And then I just interviewed a politician from Trinidad last week who was pointing out international law, due process. You don't, even if they are drug boats, you don't bomb them out of existence. Iraq, everything my country does. I mean, you could just point to every single thing the United States has done since 1898. Or maybe, you know what, while you were speaking just now, I was thinking of something very similar. What happened with the East India Company in South Asia. A lot of people don't realize that when we talk about British colonization of South Asia, a lot of what happened was done by private companies, what today might be called mercenaries or private companies plus mercenaries. And the British Army had a role in the work of the East India Company. In fact, it had to take over at a certain point. But these are things that a lot of people who are unfamiliar with this kind of history would be shocked by. That once upon a time, companies took ships, went to a way far land, and said, we're plunking down our flag. You work for us now. And the history of India is all about private exploitation married to state exploitation, right?
Absolutely. So I think that in order to make a bridge that can help people that, as you were saying, is unfamiliar with this kind of history, which, however, is fundamental for us to understand where we are today and how we get where we are today, I would like to refer to something like a betrayed promise. Of course, I put the word promise between quotes, but allow me to say this. Because if you think about it, it seems a very long time ago, even if it is not so, when we were told about the end of history by people like Francis Fukuyama, about the unstoppable globalization deemed to spread the marvels of market all around the world, and the idea and the hubris of the US at the end of the Cold War, which were proposing themselves as the force capable to really spread market forces and the neoliberal utopia around the world as a way to spread individual empowerment, access to knowledge, economic opportunities, even democracy, with the silly idea of exporting democracy that before proposing this with, let's say, bombers and missiles, it was proposed just by means of freeing capital movements, because this was the fairy tale that until the end of the 90s we were told about. And most probably this idea of the end of history is something that permeated, that diffused around global cultures and also individual perception way more that we understood. And if you think about it, the internet, so the digitalization of the global economy, has been the twin of globalization, and again has been sold as another fundamental instrument to level out all the differences, all the barriers, all the boundaries, and making again the marvels of the market really reaching everyone, even in the global south. Well, we rapidly understood that the combination of globalization and the internet turned into the most unprecedented concentration of technological and economic power we ever witnessed. You mentioned the West India Company. If you think at nowadays big tech, of course, not only the US one, because in China we have very similar corporation with a likely systemic size, yet we have corporations that are really hard to distinguish from nation states in terms of economic size, in terms of control of critical infrastructure, in terms of control of critical technologies, but also in terms of direct presence and activities in the most important levels of the public administration. But together with this, we had other phenomena like exploding inequalities, like weakening of democracies of public entities throughout both advanced and less advanced economies. And now we have conflicts and wars. We know this very well in Europe, but of course wars started spreading around in a bloody and horrible way well before. You mentioned Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the other places where since the early 2000s lots of innocent people started dying. But yet this is what under the carpet, because until, let's say, growing market and free capital movement had the opportunity to, let's say, create lots of noise and lots of illusion of such a neoliberal utopia, what was going on, as I said, under the carpet, like multiplying conflicts, like thousands of innocent people dying in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in many other places, or growing inequalities and migration flows testifying the fact that growing parts of the world were places based on extraction of raw material and of an unsustainable life, is something that never got seriously or in a mainstreamed way within our interpretation, structural interpretation of the operations of the economy, of society, and of the, so to say, drawbacks of what was told as the, let's say, only possible receipt, meaning, as I said, the new wave of globalization that started in the 90s. So basically, what we are observing right now with the clash between two poles challenging one another for the global hegemony, namely the US and China, and the intertwining of a bunch of digital corporations, which are basically the contemporary West India companies, if you like, if you allow me to say so, and their alliance with their respective governments and nation states, and in particular their military apparatuses, is something that is just telling us that capitalism may change its shape, may change its means, but the substance, the fundamental contradictions, and the suffering in terms of human beings facing the contradiction of such asymmetric distribution of power and destruction, because of course there is also the destruction of the environment that is part of such a logic, is just bringing back some of the intuitions also of what we have learned with imperialism theories and then with the monopoly capital theories back to the fore. Of course, with specific characteristics that, if you like, we can discuss, because it is also very important to face and to understand the characteristics of the specific contingency that we are facing.
Yes. Plus, a lot of times the way we're contextualize war is about invasion, and we've incorporated drones into that, but invasions by land, air, and then drones. But a lot of people, when they read things like the IMF has done this, they don't really understand the violence associated with what happens when the IMF and World Bank put their hands on a lot of these economies and gives loans in exchange for privatization of a lot of services that end up hurting enormously the most disenfranchised of those countries. So when I read your paper, I was just floored. I mean, your paper opens with a quote that I found daunting. It's true, but I'm going to read this so our listeners can have a glimpse into your paper, which I'm going to link in the description. Large digital platforms, Meta, Amazon, Alphabet, and Apple, the so-called big tech companies, which are compared to Chinese counterparts like Alibaba, JD, or Tencent, dominate the world economy. Their market capitalization has exceeded the GDP of large economies such as Germany or Japan. They control a significant share of global research and development and patents related to frontier technologies, such as artificial intelligence. These figures reflect an unprecedented concentration of techno-economic power with major implications for income distribution, access to knowledge and innovation, fragmentation, and precarization of labor, as well as on rising geopolitical tensions. At the root of this power is the control of knowledge, infrastructure, and, above all, dual-use technologies. For instance, cloud, AI, and new satellite navigation and communication systems, essential in both civilian and military spheres. Unsurprisingly, big tech companies are now key players in the clash between the two digital military-industrial complexes, China and the United States, that are competing for global hegemony. This is contributing to the blurring of the state-corporation boundaries even more than what was observed during the second half of the 20th century with the rise of transnational corporations. In this respect, the ubiquitous role of Elon Musk within the new Trump administration, or the loyalty shown by the other big tech CEOs during the swearing-in ceremony, lends support to the hypothesis of a strange convergence of interests. Ironically, we ran a piece yesterday with the photo of just that, of those four CEOs right there. Now, when I read your paper, I had goosebumps because this is something I've been thinking a lot about in my work on how media is disseminated. We now know amongst a certain demographic, a huge percent, the vast majority, are getting their news information from sources like X, TikTok, to a lesser degree Facebook, but that's another generation too. And of course, this makes people think, oh, well, that's okay. At least they're getting exposure to news. But people don't think about how and what and why. For instance, many readers, in fact, might remember my work I did 2 years ago, where I looked up the funding of The Guardian on identity politics. So we're getting identity politics daily 2 years ago. Meanwhile, why is that? Because there's funding that's going towards these kind of keyword ideas. The same thing if you look at CNN, or even I used to write for Forbes, a huge chunk of Forbes, it looks like articles, it's paid advertisement, right? So you're reading something you think is an article, it's not a listicle, so it doesn't look spammy, but it's a paid article. So yeah, I get this all the time. The last few days, I've had the same type of feed show up for news pieces. And I'll notice a pattern based on if I looked for something on the internet that day, then my feed in Facebook is influenced by this. And it's a really dangerous proposal for our democracies, where now the news that we read is being meted out by these big tech companies that know exactly our browsing histories, our shopping histories, what we are saying in messages at times. And so this is a horrifying and apocalyptic reality check, your introduction. Can you walk our listeners through what you and your colleagues have effectively demonstrated to include how mutual dependence almost obliges a symbiotic relationship between the state and big tech and the progressive militarization of digital technologies?
Yeah. So very, very quickly. First of all, I think it is important just to, let's say, add on top of what you have just said, to explain what is really different about digital platforms as compared to already super powerful corporations like General Motors, Coca-Cola, or the multinational corporation of the 20th century, which of course were super powerful entities already very intertwined with their government, with politics, with lobbying capacity, etc., etc. Well, digital platforms tend to be even more systemic and pervasive than their previous, let's say, counterparts, previous multinational corporations, for several reasons. First of all, they bring about what Shoshana Zuboff calls the surveillance business model. So their capacity to control what happens in the economic sphere, to affect consumer behavior, to create dependency relationship vis-a-vis suppliers or all the other firms which are dependent on their services, like cloud services, or think at the Amazon marketplace and the thousands of sellers that are dependent and that transfer huge rents to Amazon. Well, one fundamental explanation is the control of the nowadays gold, which is data. But they not only control data, they control data and they control all the crucial infrastructures like data centers, like submarine cables, and technologies, like all the digital technologies that characterize the digital innovation ecosystems that are needed in order to take value out from data and to make platforms that are controlled by this corporation every day more valuable, and people using them, like ourselves, more and more dependent on it. Second point, Technological competition. Once upon a time, as economists, we were told that even if there is a monopolist relying on an innovation allowing some market power, then we have to expect a new entrant, a newcomer, a startup, a new innovator, which will challenge such market power, bringing back the so-called benefits of competition. The problem is that with digital technologies and digital platforms in particular, this mechanism is mostly eliminated. Why? Because innovation, and in particular the most promising and transformative innovation, are developed in a context where technologically and financially everything is controlled by the usual suspects, like Amazon, like Microsoft, like Apple, and in fact is no by surprise that all the relevant new artificial intelligence corporations, including OpenAI, for example, has been immediately controlled and to a significant extent put within the, let's say, sphere of influence of the big tech. So basically, technological competition, rather than being something that can challenge the market power of big tech, is paradoxically fueling their innovation capacity and competitive position. But this is not enough because, as you have already mentioned, among the services and infrastructures that are controlled and which are part of their business model, which are controlled by big tech, you have social media platforms. You have domains where now not only information and news, which of course are a crucial component of shaping public opinion and affecting political dynamics, elections, etc., etc. But in general, you have that a bunch of private corporations, think at Musk with X, can control and put forth their private policies about the functioning of domains where political parties and politicians may survive or die. So basically, you have that political parties and basically institutions are more and more dependent on platforms which are used at the same time both to build up economic and monopolistic power, but also to shape information and public opinion with fundamental political implications. So this is the fundamental starting point. On top of this, I have also to add that differently from the multinational corporation that we used to study and analyze in the 20th century, platforms has another particular characteristic, which is that they have to incur very lower investment costs and costs more in general to reproduce and to expand their activities and their infrastructure as compared to the multinationals of the past. Think at an automotive corporation willing to enter into foreign markets. Well, then this corporation has to build a new plant, has to hire workers, has to incur in costly investment, in management costs, etc., etc. Think at how much easier and less costly and lighter is for companies like Alphabet is to penetrate into international market, to colonize and to control fundamental infrastructure and services like cloud, but also like internet browsers, like Alphabet has done all over Europe, for example, with a very small amount of cost, but obtaining a huge amount of profits and also of structural and political power. Now, on top of all this, what happens is that not only the state and the government, both in the US, but also in the countries that are dependent on this big tech corporation, is more and more dependent on them, can be affected and is, let's say, inclined to support the needs of this corporation. And in fact, as we have seen for 25 years, we have discussed about antitrust regulation, about taxing big tech, but in the end, very little came out from all these threats. And I mean, the power of this corporation is not a detail in this respect. But what happened with the Iraqi war and with the beginning of the new phase of conflicts that now exploded completely with the Russia-Ukraine war and with the war in Gaza is that capitalistic contradiction and the clash between the two poles, so the China and the US, make military expenditure and the need of the military apparatus again a fundamental characteristic of nowadays capitalism. There is a key moment, let's say a discontinuity, which is the Iraqi war. Why? Well, because in the Iraqi war, after the first 6 months, during which the US thought that by destroying a large part of the infrastructures and, of course, of the Iraqi military, by sending hundreds of cruise missiles from the ships around Iraq and from the planes, they basically had win the war. However, a few months later, things turned badly. Why? Well, because the US started facing a new kind of hybrid war based on guerrilla, based on, let's say, invisible enemies that were able to communicate, to move, and to operate in a way that was really hard to challenge for troops and equipment meant for traditional war. And facing such a harsh reality, what the Department of Defense and the Pentagon at some point understood was that there was a need for changing organizationally and even more so technologically the way of carrying out war. And the fundamental resource to make this change happen was in Silicon Valley. And so it is the Iraqi war and the discontinuity happening around 2002, which meant the beginning of the growing a closer relationship between Silicon Valley and between some exponents of the big tech of the times and the Pentagon. So, for example, Alphabet and Eric Schmidt were pioneers in the respect. So Eric Schmidt pioneered together with Doug Beck, then the vice president of Apple for 12 years, the first groups connecting CIA, Department of Defense, and groups aimed at building and designing a technological solution to carry out digital surveillance, to analyze what start being called big data, so unstructured data coming from different sources in order to identify targets, to predict enemies' operations, etc., and also the first technologies related to autonomous weapons, including drones. So this is the phase during which, initially under the carpet, hidden. Why? Well, because big tech were in this moment in their ascendant phase. They were penetrating and colonizing world markets, including China. So their reputation and their way of proposing themselves as far from politics, as far from big government, for sure far away from the traditional military-industrial complex of the 20th century, was a fundamental ingredient to internationalize and to be the main characters of the neoliberal utopia that I mentioned before. However, as we have to remember that there is an originally linkage which brings together the military R&D, military projects in the US, and the internet. And so the companies that took the greatest competitive advantage by the commercialization and the privatization of the internet, well, of course, big tech cannot say no to the request for help of the Pentagon and of the DoD. And that's why this is the phase during which, as I said, initially not open air, so to say, but important projects involving big tech in the development of technologies and the development of dual technologies for military and intelligence purposes started becoming an important matter. Yet at these points, our understanding of big tech and also, let's say, the characteristics of big tech in terms of what matters more for them was about commercial markets and was about making ourselves more and more dependent on their services like social media, like internet browsers, like all the apps that we can think downloading on our smartphones. And at the times, the importance of military expenditure for big tech profits was rather negligible, okay? Yet it wasn't unstrategic, the alliance with the governments and with the military apparatus for obvious reasons. Well, then things start changing. Things start changing because China start becoming an increasingly serious threat from an economic, a technological, and then a military point of view. Russia starts becoming a more serious threat from a military point of view, and in general, capitalistic contradictions start multiplying and exploding all around, starting also with the financial crisis and the systemic crisis, which after 2008 plagued the world economy. And that's when the mutual dependency between the state and in particular the military apparatus and big tech start becoming stronger and start becoming a peculiar characteristic of contemporary capitalism. Why? Well, because for the state, the alliance with corporations controlling key infrastructure, key digital technologies, having the financial size that we mentioned, but most importantly, controlling and developing in terms of both research and of innovation development, technologies that are fundamental to fight on the battlefield and to carry out surveillance and military activities becomes a fundamental task, and such alliance becomes irrenounceable. On the other hand, big tech start facing opposition of foreign governments starting being unhappy of becoming completely dependent from a technological and an economic point of view vis-a-vis big tech, like Europe, that every now and then says, well, but we have to make we have to find big tech, we have to make them paying a little bit more taxes. We have to pursue what the EU in a silly way calls technological sovereignty. I'm saying a silly way because we are completely dependent of big tech. So that's why I think it is silly, because the reality is a different one. But for big tech, these are problems, because this means having problems in their strategy of expansion and of profit accumulation. And so the alliance with the state, as we are seeing also now with Trump, but it was just the same with the Biden administration, becomes an alliance which is fundamental to support and help big tech in their international activities, and if there are struggles with international governments, and of course in trying to prevent competitors like Chinese big tech, think at the fight against Huawei, to penetrate in markets that the US big tech would like to control. But there is another, if you like, even more important point for what we are witnessing today, which is the fact that military expenditure and actual wars become, unfortunately, the harsh reality of our everyday lives, because the share of GDPs devoted to military expenditure, as we know, is skyrocketing all over the world, and wars like the Russia-Ukraine war are context where not only public expenditure, but also opportunity to test, develop, and implement new technologies become crucial domains of interest for big tech. And so basically the mutual dependency that we have documented in the paper goes in these two directions. On the one hand, the state cannot do without big tech for the reasons that I said. On the other, for big tech, the support of the state is fundamental as an ally to support international activities and digital colonization around the world, but also in order to siphon out the growing amount of public resources that are channeled through military expenditure, R&D, and investment. And of course, participating actively in warfare scenarios like the US big tech are doing in Gaza, supporting the IDF, killing and destroying Palestinians, or in Ukraine by managing most of the digital infrastructure and supporting Ukrainian militaries in this respect, are just examples of how integrated the military digital complex is becoming and how strategic the military domain, military investments, military R&D, and direct participation in warfare activities became for big tech.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. This is a lot to swallow, and yet there's been a lot of research showing early on how Google was implementing ways of controlling even the US election. And you've had a lot of research scientists getting data on this to show how adverts were able to convince people who were on the fence to vote in a certain way. Yet, here we are believing. I love Shoshana Zuboff's book quite a bit because it goes into all sorts of areas about this kind of line of reality and the theater that were presented. And it reminds me of that Mark Twain quote where he says, if voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it. So here we are on this precipice of a world where Zuboff says this at one point. She says, Google is a shapeshifter, but each shape harbors the same aim, to hunt and capture raw material. Baby, won't you ride my car? Talk to my phone, wear my shirt, use my map. In all these cases, the very torrent of creative shapes is the sideshow to the main event. The continuous expansion of the extraction architecture to acquire new raw material at scale to feed an expensive production process that makes prediction products that attract and retain more customers, end quote. What you three have compiled here is so daunting to me because what it seems to say is that this kind of interlacing of state power with big tech, and you and I by email, we talked about this because I had asked, are you planning to do any research about media and how news articles are part of this and how even not only news articles, but the way media covers the news, the way media makes the news, right? Because what we're seeing is that we're having an entire world curated for us. We didn't have any kind of open public discussion about, do we want these instruments that are going to track our every whereabouts in our lives? Do we want, I'll give you an example here. I've had discussions with my children's school. I've got to be the most unpopular parent, but I talked to my children's school back before lockdown about their use of Google. And I said, are you aware? And they, of course, don't want to hear about the links between Google creating spyware or drone software. They don't want to know about it because, as you know, in Italy, when we went to an open day event on Sunday for my son, who'll be going to the media school soon, I said, do you use other browsers besides Google? No, was the answer I received. Because the idea is this kind of homogenization of knowledge and of practice. So, of course, they're not going to teach people to use anything related to alternative, even online products, right? And here we are in this very strange moment where we've got a genocide going on in Gaza, a lesser publicized one in Sudan, and people believe that by clicking on a like button or a heart button, that this is somehow going to propagate political action, where in fact, I believe Zubhov's, one of her sub-theses is, these are distractions. And these are ways of keeping the populace tame while they get on with business as usual. They trade. And if I can, I ask you to talk about this article that you three again wrote together. And it is this piece, Monopoly Capital in the Time of Digital Platforms, a Radical Approach to the Amazon Case. And this is an article that takes a look at Amazon, but during the lockdown era. And I'm wondering if you could discuss this article in relationship to your more recent piece, which we've been discussing, because I think it's quite interesting to see how many of the skeptics of the pandemic people who believe this was engineered and there was a forceful closing up of society to make the wealthy richer and to impoverish the middle class and, of course, the poor. And I'm wondering if you could speak about this, because this analysis of Amazon is fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, I think that trying to, in a way, add on what you have just said and to recall some of the elements that we put into the article, also in the light of what you have said, there are two words that come to my mind. The first one is the non-neutral nature of technology. So what happened since the 90s with the neoliberal hegemony and with the idea of internet and of a globalized economy as a neutral force is that in the end, technology is something inevitable, is something neutral that will just, in an inevitable way, change our lives, mostly for the good, in the sense of making things more efficient, information more accessible, etc., etc. Of course, we know that this is not the case. Of course, those who build on critical studies know that technologies are non-neutral, that technologies are embedded in power relationships, that technologies are designed and put forth by entities having power and willing to reinforce and strengthen their power. In the case of digital technologies, the kind of dependency relationship and also the kind of fundamental reduction of autonomy and also of critical understanding of reality that we are all, unfortunately, losing in the way you were mentioning before. So not only we are not realizing that by putting a like below a Facebook post, we are not doing anything which can be considered seriously political, but we are fueling our dependency and we are, let's say, giving up to our autonomy and radical critical thinking, which is what fueled, on the other end, let's say, radical and alternative political movements in the 20th century in a very clear way. So basically, what happens is that Amazon can be considered as a kind of archetypical example of a private corporation aiming at dominating markets by means of a business model which not only creates in a fundamental way economic and technological dependency. Basically, think at Amazon as a company becoming the market. So in many places, if you would like to access to many goods, you need to go through the Amazon marketplace, like in China, the Alibaba marketplace. In China, you also have to use Alibaba or Tencent if you would like to pay anything. Otherwise, it's very hard to pay for something to eat or for whatever service you may think. But not only this, by becoming dependent in this way, considering that these platforms tend to control means of communications and in general most of the services that we need for both working but also pursue our everyday life, we are more and more losing autonomy also in a political sense. And if you think at this in a more, let's say, collective and massive way, and you think at youngsters growing up considering something normal, being completely dependent on few private corporations about, let's say, fundamental things like communicating, like looking for information or obtaining information, like buying things, etc., etc. Well, this is something that, on the one hand, strengthen the economic power of this corporation, their capacity to control the economic sphere, but also society at large. And this explains also their strength vis-à-vis the government. But on the other hand, it weakens in a fundamental way the political resources of society at large and also of ourselves as individuals. And in fact, it's very sad that even if, for example, concerning Gaza's genocide, I think it is important that we had people on social media becoming very popular in diffusing information, in influencing public opinion, so to say, in the right way. However, the very risk is that even those who are honestly trying to campaign and to put forth, let's say, the right arguments or to fight for the rights of those who are at the bottom of the pyramid, so to say, then are eaten and are eaten by the system and by platforms themselves. They become products in a way, and their capacity to strengthen, promote, and contribute to broad autonomy, critical thinking, and really radical and radical political action is significantly resized due to the pervasive nature and penetrative nature of these technologies that are, on the one hand, systemic and make ourselves so fundamentally dependent of them for obvious reasons. But on the other hand, they penetrate into ourselves also as individuals, in particular concerning our capacity to be autonomous and to be politically critical with respect to what technologies, but so what also relationships from an economic and a social point of view are.
I was just thinking about how your generation, mine, we grew up without all of the social media. We grew up with in real life interactions. And one thing I've noticed in my work dealing with Western subjects, for instance, is over the past decade, there has just been a plummeting of in real life social interactions. Many people are maintaining their lives almost entirely online, except for going to a class or going to the office. And this kind of monopolization of our lives has become itself a product, like you said earlier. And so if you remember back a few years, the Ice Bucket Challenge, everyone was doing the Ice Bucket Challenge. Again, ostensibly a good cause, I guess, but these campaigns become immediately cannibalized by social media, and they become cliche, and then they become toothless. It's the idea that even Michel Foucault talks about this, that once you challenge power, in a way you are not disempowering it. And we're repeating the same kind of genuflecting to these systems by merely using them, yet can we get out of using them? No. My telephone broke last month. I couldn't do a thing. I couldn't do banking. Nothing. You can't pay bills in Italy without a mobile phone. Even if you want to use the web browser, you have to approve it on your mobile. So I was in a hot hunt for a new phone, and I thought, wait a sec, what if I want out of this? What if I want to be a Luddite? The system does not want us out of this. And this is the thing in your article. You note on Amazon specifically, you note what happened during a certain period of our history and how Amazon was able to dominate the other trading companies and suppliers because of its diversification and control of data and technology. And this is something that when I was swimming in the summer of 2020 and talking to people who lost their restaurants, they lost their businesses. These were small mom and pop restaurants in Liguria. And I'm thinking, wait a sec, everyone I meet has lost everything. How are they going forth? A lot of these people were not in their 30s or 20s. They were in their late 40s and their 50s. And in a country like Italy, you can't just bounce back and reinvent yourself like Madonna. Age discrimination exists, and people have lost their entire capital. And here we were watching and participating in often the way in which Amazon took over because of being locked down. Could you talk a bit about how the COVID-19 pandemic made a kind of empowerment to big tech and to big companies that are aided and abetted by big tech?
So let me come straight to your point. Well, yes, of course. I mean, I think that in many instances, crises are generated by capitalism. In this case, for example, if we think that COVID, one of the explanations was that COVID was, let's say, determined by the environmental impact and the impact on wild animals, determined by a kind of unsustainable economic development, of mass consumption, of destruction of the environment. I don't want to get into the various hypotheses about the origins of COVID, but just to say that we know that in many instances capitalism is incompatible with a let's say sustainable environment. And so in this respect, we had a crisis which which killed a lot of people and which caused a huge damage throughout the world, but that offered huge opportunities of accumulation and of strengthening of economic positions to entities like the big tech, which were already super powerful before. So in the case of Amazon, as Amazon meant, as I said, not only domination and colonization of markets, but also monopolization of fundamental sectors and services like logistics, for example, in the US, which were mostly cannibalized by Amazon. But even in China, I mean, the Chinese big tech have been crucial entities in managing the logistics and, of course, the delivery of goods during the pandemic. But this meant huge profits for them, strengthening their position in markets, possibility to keep on their economic activities also let's say, exposing most of their workers not only at horrible working conditions, but also at huge health risks. But in this case, as these were instrumental to the monopolistic profits of this corporation, this was not a problem, of course. And so you are, let's say, pointing to a very relevant issue, I would say, because during the pandemic, what we have seen is that both the unfolding of the pandemic crisis, but also the political decisions that have been taken during the crisis were directly in support of the interests of big tech on the one hand, with the huge privatization of digital technologies and digital infrastructure that, of course, were crucial during the times of the lockdown and of the pandemic, but in general, and of course also of big pharma. As we know, all the political decision has been taken in a way, in particular in the Western world. I'm not sure about Russia and China. There, one should one should research a little bit how things went in those countries in this respect. But what we had in the Western world has been governments, think at the European Union, completely subordinated and instrumental to big pharma, and so translating an health crisis in a huge amount of extra profits for companies which knowledge and innovation, so basically the vaccines that then have been put forth and diffused, have been developed and generated mostly with public funds, public knowledge, and public R&D. So the COVID crisis is just an example of a crisis that most probably is the result of the contradiction and of the unsustainable nature of capitalism as such, and that crisis may turn into something that generates huge sufferings, inequalities, and injustice on the one hand, and huge opportunities for profits accumulation and strengthening of economic positions for the usual suspects, which are, in this case, big tech, but also big pharma.
I'm thinking about the way in which the pandemic people were mocked, and yet today we have the proof that even if they were just making a guess, they were not incorrect. I have a theory about the introduction of lockdown here in Italy because of the data, which people said initially it started here, but the data seems to show that's not the case. And I had to wonder if it wasn't because Italy has one of the highest or the highest home ownership rates in all of Western Europe, right? I couldn't help but think about that. But at the same time, your study here shows basically that there is a kind of control behind this rationale of capitalism, that we are, in a way, we have no choice. We are capitalistic subjects, whether or not we like it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating discussion, and I don't want to provide a, let's say, inevitable pessimistic kind of message. I think that doing research, having intellectual discussions as this one, critical thinking, trying to cultivate our autonomy intellectually, but also in our personal and professional lives, is a fundamental thing in life, both individually and collectively speaking. And in the end, if we look back at history, we just see things changing and changing, most often also for the bad, not necessarily for the good, but for sure we also see that human beings have capacity to change, to transform, and to produce things that are different, unexpected, and that can be different from what we have seen before. So I think that what makes me happy about the research that we have done on big tech, on the digitally military complex, is that this is something that is shaping our lives way more than we understand. So if research from a scientific and then a divulgative point of view could be a way to diffuse a little bit of consciousness and to transmit something close to critical thinking and so to political thinking about this thing, this could be at least a good first step. Then we don't know what happens, and there is, of course, also a rationale in being pessimistic to a certain extent. Yet, I mean, I think that it could be useful. Keep on, let's say, discussing, having this kind of confrontation, doing to the extent we have money, spaces, public universities allowing us to do so, research of this kind, because this is at least something that from where we can start.